Hello folks, welcome back. We today are starting part 2 of our Gledhill Brook time recorder series. In our last part, we went through the time movement, got that all cleaned, overhauled, and talked a lot about the fusee mechanism that is what maintains the clock accuracy as the spring winds down. That has been running successfully for a handful of days now, and we are now ready to start attacking the punch mechanism. I mentioned in the first part how disgusting this movement is, and I barely have words to describe it. So we're gonna attack that as we go here and just dive right in. All right, we're out of the clock, and before we tear into this thing, I want to just evaluate if all of the functions of this are working. Some of these we've seen before. If I turn this left thing, minutes move in the middle there, and then once I hit the end of the hour, there goes an hour. So this is working. On the other side is this shaft, which is what controls our day of the week. And it also works with our card lifting foot, which is this thing down here that's hard to see. That is not working completely. You can see that when this gear goes around, it starts lifting the foot shaft, but then it just falls back into its original position. And so what's not working is this little pawl that is back here. It appears to be frozen, and so that's supposed to lock into this rack system, and it's not doing that. This just always falls down to its lowest position. So we're gonna have to look at that and see why it's frozen. That's probably just a lubrication issue. Other functions, we can see the card left-right indexer, and this is for the in-out for each shift. That's stiff, but it's working, so hopefully a lube job will solve that. And if I press down on the punching lever, we can see that it is advancing our ribbon, so that's good. And it's hard for me to hold this with one hand and fire it, but that does work. Oops, there it goes. Sorry for the shaky camera. So I think we're in pretty good shape with the exception of the frozen cam on this day of the week lifting lever. So that's really encouraging. It does seem like everything is present. So I'm going to remove the ribbon and then start the degreasing process. Before taking on disassembly, I decided to take a crack at whatever desliming I could do with it still attached. So I used one of those green automotive cleaners and a Zoolander-sized pile of paper towels and a toothbrush to get at least some of the gunk off. And it definitely looks a little better. One of the other things that came to light is the mechanism that switches the direction of the ribbon. I have not worked on this mechanism before, so this is going to be a little bit of an adventure together as we figure out how to make the clock work. But I want to talk about how that function works. So this thing, when you run it through the ribbon and you reach the end, what happens? How do you make the clock resilient? If I press down on the punching mechanism here, we can see that the ribbon spool, which is up on this shaft, is driven by a gear here attached to the main punching lever. Again, apologies for the challenging camera shots. And so that causes the ribbon to wind this way, going from right to left. But when it hits the end, what happens? Well, there is a cool arrangement of these two levers that are right next to the spools. And if I push this lever this way, and now I advance my punch lever, I'm now driving the gear on the other side, which reverses the ribbon, and it now moves from left to right. And the way that it knows how to do that is on the ribbon itself. Apologize for the sun. It's rare up here in Minnesota, but we're grateful when we have it. There is a little rivet that is punched in toward the end of the ribbon, which pushes on this narrow gap in this lever, and then that is what causes the direction to reverse. So there's one of those rivets on either end of the ribbon, which will mean that this will happily feed the ribbon back and forth until eternity, or until it gets too faint to be readable, and then you load it up with some new ink and away you go. The other thing that I was able to work out just doing the coarse degreasing was getting this little pawl to work inside here. And so now you can see that as I turn our day of the week lever, this is raising. And this is the 14 positions of the time card. That's AM and PM for 7 days in a week. So I believe we have tested all of the functions of the punch mechanism. There are our foot reset. And all we need to do now, is get this thing apart and clean it up. You can see that there's surface rust in a variety of places, and I degreased it, but that's a far cry from actually being clean and restored. So I'm going to take a crack at disassembling this. It appears the punching module is somewhat self-contained, and I don't want to spend 3 hours of video as I struggle with how to get this thing apart. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to take this one side off. There are a variety of bars that set the width of the machine, as well as a few screws that need to come out. So I'm going to do that off camera and try to get this video a little shorter so we can cover just the more interesting pieces. After a few screws and a gentle tap with the dead blow hammer, we have our right plate off. And so that will help us attack this and get this cleaned up and reassembled. And also I can treat this as a module, which is really nice. This is a mechanism I've never used. And so being able to decrease the number of puzzle pieces is going to greatly help me get this back together in a reasonable amount of time. Here is the central part of the punch mechanism. And I think we can probably get that out next. And so I'm going to work on that and then probably cut back in a while after I find something interesting to show you and or start getting it ready to put back together. Well, we've got the right side stripped down finally. I admit I stooped to WD-40 to get a couple of the screws loose. And if any of you have worked with an ultrasonic cleaner before, you will know that ultrasonic cleaners and WD-40 don't go well together. So I've done my best with a couple more rounds of the green stuff to get whatever latent WD-40 off there may be. And my fluid is getting kind of to the end anyway, so I'm gonna chance it. We'll throw it in, we'll see what happens. This is cast brass, this piece right here. And so hopefully it'll brighten up nice. You can see it doesn't entirely fit, so I'll have to run this in a couple orientations to get it all covered. Wanted to pop in and show you the one end that I have cleaned up and compare it to the yet to be cleaned end. Got everything shined up here. This is the cast brass, and I didn't want to spend 5 more hours polishing this, so I left it in kind of the state that it came out of the ultrasonic cleaner in, and that's going to be fine for the inside of the clock. And more yet to go on this side. The outer frame is cleaned up and ready to be put back together. So next is the punch mechanism. This thing I sprayed a bunch of degreaser on, and that helped temporarily, but I think it actually made it worse in that now the mechanism is actually frozen on the hour and minute side. Not a surprise, obviously we need to tackle this, but I just thought that was interesting that the initial cleaning actually removed whatever lubricity was left of the grease, and now it's even worse than it was before. The magic of video allows us to skip the 6 or so hours of desliming and polishing that I have into this, and we can instead jump right to how this mechanism works. On the left side is the minute and hour mechanism, and on the right side is the AM, PM, and day of the week mechanism. So if we start on the right side, we can see this lever that connects to our card foot that indexes the card up and down for every day of the week. One time card is good for a week. And the time mechanism drives this shaft here, and every time around it advances our day of the week indicator, as well as it lifts our card foot 1 notch. And so this continues AM and PM 7 days of the week until right there when we reset. On the left side is the minute and hour mechanism. Now this is a little complicated because this lever over here connects to the punching mechanism, and in order for the minute and hour mechanism to work, I have to actually hold this open. And so it's a little bit awkward. So this lever is driven from the time movement up above, And if I turn this, you can see the minutes advancing, and then the hour will advance when we come around. There it went, to 60 minutes. Now, in many clocks, the synchronization of all of the things, typically the strike mechanism or the chime mechanism, is left to the repairer, who has to sort out how all the wheels fit together. And you, in some clocks, have to keep separating the plates and rotating gears relative to each other, and trial and error, and lots of time later, hopefully you get it right. This movement is very well designed, and there are a couple of those things that have to be manually resynchronized, but very few, and I think that's just great. In the minute and hour synchronization is actually done in such a way that it's only able to be assembled correctly. There is a little pawl lever that actually connects, it's impossible to show on the camera, between these two gears, and that is a big part of the mechanism that causes this to be synchronized. And you see there's a little notch that is right here on that wheel, and this pawl down here falls into this notch, and that is what allows the hour wheel to advance by means of this little cam over here. And so you can only put it together correctly, and that's really wonderful, especially as I mentioned earlier that I have not worked on this particular mechanism before. The other neat thing that they've accounted for is if a user happens to be punching the clock while the minute needs to advance, how do you account for that? And over here, there's this ratchet mechanism and then this lever that I was holding open here. They work to stall the clock, where I can advance this without this lever being held down. The clock can advance, but this hasn't moved yet because it's in punching mode, and then as soon as I release this lever, the clock will advance and let that minute be recorded on the clock. And so it's a really resilient mechanism. I think at this point I need to put it back in the broader punching frame to do final testing, and then that one synchronization that I may need to do is the relationship between these two gears here, which will set where the day of the week actually fires relative to the foot. So I'm going to pause the video here, and we're going to put the rest of the punching mechanism back together, and we'll take a look. The mechanism is now fully assembled in the frame. You can see the punch mechanism centered in the middle here. And on the other side, you can see what I was showing you a minute ago with this lever being held up by the lower punching mechanism. And that allows the time mechanism to advance, which is paused when you push down on the punching lever. Then that time is just stored up in that suspension spring and is released when the operator releases the punch lever. So that's pretty cool. Getting it back into the frame was relatively easy. The only adjustments I had to do were the ribbon advance mechanisms, but otherwise this came out just like it went in. So I think we're in good shape. I'm going to put it back in the clock. What I don't know is if I have some alignment issue with the day of the week or the other numbers, and so I'm not going to know that until I put a piece of paper in it. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this in the clock, and we'll see what we got. With the punch mechanism mounted in the clock, we now have to do some alignment of the punch mechanism with the time side of the movement, and then actually the punch mechanism with itself. So we'll take a look at the day of the week first. We can see on the left, there's our day of the week wheel. And what we want is for that to line up with the hour and the minutes. I can manually push my hammer in, and that will show me what is actually going to be printed. And what I can do is I can adjust my linkage here. I can just loosen the screws, and then I can adjust this slightly to make my day of the week value move up and down for when it's printed. What triggers that is this big lever up here. So that advances it, and obviously when that lever is in the lower position, that's going to determine where the day of the week wheel is going to land. So with this fully down, we can adjust our linkage so that the day of the week lines up where we want it to. One other thing that needs to be adjusted, and that is our day of the week lifting foot. There is a pin on the back of this wheel right here which holds the cam that allows this to drop down. And so unless you guessed right, this may not be correct. It may drop on Tuesday morning or something rather than Saturday morning, which is how this clock is supposed to be. And so the easiest way to deal with that is to just rotate the clock around until you can access this wheel back here, which has a set screw on it, and then you can slide it out of meshing with the day of the week wheel here, and then spin this after you've run this up and down so that we're at the full low position. There we go. We can now, if we unmesh this wheel, we can turn our day of the week wheel until it says Saturday AM, and then remesh that wheel by just loosening that screw that you can see right there. So that is the day of the week, and we should be able to have that line up and show the day along with where it's going to punch. And if you hold the lever down slightly, that will align the wheels a little bit and make it look like it's going to print. So let's talk about the minute and hour system. This is a 12-hour clock. The punch mechanism knows about AM and PM and the days of the week. That's done via this rod off of this lever up here. But the clock mechanism actually doesn't. The clock mechanism doesn't know the difference between noon and midnight. And so we only have to care about when that changeover happens and making the hands on the time movement match the numbers here. So the first thing we want to do is figure out when midnight is and try to get that as close as we can to when the hand is at 12. If you watch the lifting cam as I crank the minute hand around, you can see it getting ready to fire. And we're very, very close here. All right, there it went. And so the way the gears are meshing now, the clock is going to change from AM to PM at about 7 minutes to midnight. If that's close enough for you, great, you can stop right here. If you want to do a little bit better, we can work on remeshing the gears to try to get the minute hand closer to 12 when that happens. To remesh the gears, I've removed both of the pivot supports for this intermediate wheel and the cam wheel, and that gave me enough room where I could just back up this wheel one tooth. I put the minute hand back on, and now we should be closer to this actuating. We're about, a minute and a half after, which is good enough for me. So we know that this is now midnight, and so or noon. It doesn't really matter because the punch mechanism is going to handle that. Now we can just turn our linkage forward until our punch mechanism reads 12 o'clock, and then we'll be all synchronized. And there we go, 12:01 on the puncher, which matches 12:01 on the clock. I'm going to lock that linkage back together now.